The old freighter groaned as it slowed down near Relay Station Omega 7, and Marcus Chen rubbed his tired eyes as the docking clamps locked into place with a heavy thunk. He had been flying for 3 weeks straight, carrying medical supplies to a small colony that most people had forgotten existed, and his body ached from sleeping in a chair that was never meant for comfort. Marcus was 34 years old, with dark hair that he never bothered to comb properly, and hands that were rough from years of manual labor on ships that were always breaking down. He was nobody special, just another human trying to make a living among the stars, and that was exactly how he liked it. Humans were new to space, having only joined the Galactic Concord about 20 years ago, and most alien species treated them like children who had wandered into a room full of adults. They were tolerated but never respected, ignored but never truly welcomed, and Marcus had learned to keep his head down and do his job without causing trouble. The station was old and dirty, with flickering lights and walls that showed rust in places where the maintenance crews had stopped caring long ago. It sat on the edge of contested space, a place where traders and smugglers and refugees all mixed together in a desperate dance of survival. Marcus needed fuel and maybe a hot meal that did not come from a package, so he locked up his ship and walked into the main corridor of the station. The air smelled like oil and sweat, and something sweet that he could not identify, and dozens of alien species moved past him without a second glance. There were tall beings with blue skin and too many arms, short creatures covered in thick fur, and things that looked like walking crystals that made soft chiming sounds as they moved. Marcus kept to the side of the corridor, staying out of everyone's way as he searched for a food vendor that might accept his. He found a small stall selling something that looked like soup and bought a bowl, eating it slowly while he watched the crowds flow past him like a river of strange colors and shapes. It was not bad, though he had no idea what he was actually eating, and he decided that sometimes it was better not to ask questions. After finishing his meal, Marcus wandered through the lower levels of the station, looking for a parts dealer who might have a replacement filter for his engine. The lower levels were darker and quieter, with fewer people and more shadows, and the walls here were covered in strange stains that he preferred not to think about. He was walking past a row of old storage containers when he heard a sound that made him stop. It was soft, barely louder than a whisper, but it sounded like crying. Marcus looked around and saw nothing at first, but then he noticed a small gap between two containers, and something was moving in there. Darkness there. He knelt down slowly, being careful not to make any sudden movements, and his eyes adjusted to the shadows. What he saw made his heart twist painfully in his chest. It was a child, an alien girl no bigger than a human 7-year-old, and she was curled up in the darkness like a wounded animal. Her skin was pale lavender, almost gray in the dim light, and she had 4 eyes that were sunken and dull with hunger. She was so thin that Marcus could see every bone in her small body, and her clothes were nothing but torn rags that barely covered her. The girl flinched when she saw him looking at her, pressing herself deeper into the shadows as if she wanted to disappear completely. Marcus recognized her species from the trade documents he had studied when he first started hauling cargo. She was Valith, from a powerful empire that controlled dozens of star systems, but something was very wrong here. On her rags, faded symbols that he had read about in warnings to human traders. She was a Katsera, what the Valith called the untouchable caste, and everything Marcus had learned about them came rushing back to his mind. The Katsera were forbidden from receiving help from anyone, forbidden from being fed or touched or even spoken to, and they were expected to simply fade away and die. It was considered sacred law among the Valith, a tradition that supposedly went back thousands of years, and anyone who violated it faced severe punishment. Marcus had always thought it was cruel and horrible when he read about it, but reading about something and seeing it were two very different things. This was not a concept in a document anymore. This was a real child who was starving to death in a dark corner, while the whole galaxy walked past her and pretended she did not exist. He could see the fear in her 4 eyes, the desperate hunger that she had. Probably stopped hoping would ever be satisfied, and something inside Marcus simply broke. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a ration bar, one of the emergency supplies he always carried with him on long trips. The girl stared at the food in his hand like it was something from a dream, something that could not possibly be real. Her whole body was trembling, and Marcus could tell that she wanted to reach for it, but was terrified of what might happen if she did. He held the ration bar out to her and kept his voice soft and gentle, speaking slowly so she might understand, even if she did not know his language. "It is okay," he said quietly. "You can take it. I promise no one is going to hurt you." She did not move at first, just kept staring at him with those 4 huge eyes that were filling with tears. Marcus waited patiently, not pushing or demanding, just holding out the food and letting her make her own choice, passed in silence. And then, slowly, so slowly, a thin lavender hand reached out from the shadows. Her fingers were shaking badly as they touched the ration bar, and she pulled it back quickly as if she expected him to snatch it away. When he did not move, when he just smiled at her gently, something in her expression changed. She looked at the food in her hands and then back at him, and Marcus saw something that broke his heart all over again. She was confused, genuinely confused, because no one had ever shown her kindness before, and she did not know how to understand it. She bit into the ration bar and ate it faster than Marcus had ever seen anyone eat anything, and tears were streaming down her face the whole time. He stayed there with her, kneeling on the dirty floor of a forgotten station, watching a child eat like it was her first meal in weeks. And it probably was, he realized, with a sick feeling in his stomach. Think about the laws he was breaking, or the trouble he might face, because none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was this little girl who had been thrown away by the galaxy, and the simple fact that he could not just walk away and leave her there. He pulled out another ration bar and handed it to her, and this time she took it without hesitation. She looked up at him with those 4 tear-filled eyes, and even though she could not speak his language, he understood exactly what she was trying to say. No one had ever seen her before, not really, but this strange human had stopped and looked and cared. Marcus had no idea that this simple act of feeding a hungry child was about to change everything. He did not know that alarms were about to sound, or that powerful forces were already moving against him. All he knew was that she was hungry and scared and alone, and he had the ability to help her. And for Marcus Chen, that was all that had ever mattered. The alarms started screaming through the station corridors like the wail of an angry beast, and Marcus barely had time to stand up before heavy footsteps came pounding toward him. Station security guards appeared from every direction, their weapons raised and their faces twisted with a mix of fear and confusion. Behind them came a tall, veilless male, dressed in robes of deep purple and gold, and his 4 eyes were burning with a fury that made the air itself feel cold. "Seize that human," the veilless commanded, in a voice that dripped with disgust. "He has committed a crime against the sacred laws of our people." Marcus stepped in front of the little girl instinctively, shielding her with his body, even though he knew he had no way to fight against so many armed guards. "She is just a child," Marcus said firmly. "She was starving to death, and I gave her food. That is not a crime." The veiled male stepped closer, and Marcus could see the expensive fabric of the robes, jewelry hanging from his elongated ears, and the symbol of high office embroidered on his chest. This was no ordinary Valith. This was someone with real power, and the hatred in his eyes made it clear that he intended to use that power. "I am High Prefect Zorath Vel of the Valith Hegemony," the alien announced, loudly enough for everyone in the corridor to hear. "And you have desecrated our most sacred traditions." Marcus did not back down, even as the guards grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. "Your tradition says children should starve to death in the dark," Marcus replied through gritted teeth, "and I do not care how sacred you think that is." Zorath Vel's face twisted with even greater anger, and he made a sharp gesture with one long-fingered hand. Two guards moved past Marcus and grabbed the little girl, pulling her out of her hiding spot despite her terrified screams. "No," Marcus shouted, struggling against the hands that held him. "Leave her alone. She did nothing wrong." But the guards ignored him completely, dragging the crying child away, while Zorath Vel watched with cold satisfaction. "She has been contaminated by your touch," the High Prefect explained in a tone that suggested he was speaking to something beneath contempt. "She will be purified through the sacred ritual, which means she will be executed." Marcus felt ice flood through his veins as the meaning of those words sank in. They were going to kill her, this little girl who had done nothing except accept food from someone who cared enough to offer it. "You cannot do this," Marcus yelled as they dragged him in the opposite direction. "This is murder. She is just a child." Zorath Vel laughed, and it was an ugly sound that held no warmth or mercy. "She is nothing," he said dismissively. "She was born to die, and you have only made her death more painful by giving her false hope." Marcus into a security holding cell and sealed the door behind him, leaving him alone with his rage and his fear. He paced the small room like a caged animal, unable to stop thinking about that little girl and what they were going to do to her. Hours passed, and eventually a Concord official came to explain the situation in careful diplomatic language that made Marcus want to scream. He had committed something called a Class 7 cultural violation, which was apparently a very serious crime under galactic law. The Valith Hegemony was demanding that Marcus be handed over to them for punishment, and that punishment was death. The Galactic Concord was supposed to protect member species from interference in their cultural practices, and that included practices that humans found horrifying. "Earth is a new member of the Concord," the official said nervously. "We cannot afford to start a conflict with the Valith Hegemony over one cargo hauler." Marcus stared at the alien through the transparent wall of his cell and felt something cold settle in his chest. "So you are going to hand me over to them," he said flatly. "You are going to let them execute me for feeding a hungry child." The official looked away, unable to meet his eyes, and Marcus had his answer. They were going to sacrifice him to keep the peace, and that little girl was going to die too, and the galaxy would just keep spinning like nothing had happened. But then, something unexpected happened. A communication drone floated into the holding area, and a Concord technician explained that Marcus had the right to make a statement before his transfer. It was supposed to be just a formality, a chance for condemned prisoners to say goodbye to their families or apologize for their crimes. But Marcus was not going to apologize. Not for this, not ever. He stood in front of the drone and looked directly into its recording lens, knowing that his words would be broadcast across the entire Concord network. "My name is Marcus Chen," he began, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his gut. "I am a human, and I am going to die because I fed a starving child." He paused to let those words sink in before continuing. "The Valith call her Kessera, which means she is supposed to be invisible, supposed to starve and suffer and die while everyone looks the other way." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice calm and clear. "She was a little girl hiding in the dark, crying because she was so hungry it hurt. And I gave her a ration bar because that was the right thing to do. He could see the Concord officials shifting uncomfortably, but he did not care about their discomfort. I am told that I violated sacred Valith law, and maybe I did, but I want every being watching this to understand something very important. Clearly, Marcus leaned closer to the drone, his eyes burning with conviction. Feeding a hungry child is not a crime. It will never be a crime, and I do not care what laws or traditions or sacred texts say otherwise. He straightened up and crossed his arms over his chest. The Valith can execute me if they want, but they cannot make me say that what I did was wrong, because it was not wrong. His voice grew stronger as he spoke his final words. If your culture tells you to let children starve to death, then your culture is broken, and I would rather die than pretend otherwise. The drone stopped recording, and the officials quickly ushered it out of the room, their faces pale with shock. Marcus did not know it yet, but his words were already spreading across the galaxy like wildfire. Every species with access to the Concord network was watching, listening, and for many of them, something was beginning to change. Holding cell, Marcus sat down on the cold bench and closed his eyes. He thought about the little girl, wondering if she was scared, wondering if she understood what was happening to her. He wished he could tell her that he was sorry, not for helping her, but for not being able to help her more. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if anyone out there would even care what happened to one human and one Valith child. He was about to find out that humanity cared very much indeed. The message reached Earth in 47 minutes, traveling through relay stations and communication networks, until it burst across every screen on the planet. People stopped what they were doing in offices and homes and schools, watching a tired man in a holding cell explain why he was going to die. For a long moment after the broadcast ended, there was silence across the entire human species. Then the silence broke like a dam giving way to a flood. In Tokyo, a cargo ship captain named Yuki Tanaka watched the message 3 times before standing up and walking to her bridge. "Change course," she told her crew, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "We are going to Relay Station Omega 7. Her navigator looked at her with wide eyes and asked about their delivery schedule. "The delivery can wait," Yuki replied firmly. "That man saved a child and they want to kill him for it. I am not going to sit here and do nothing." Scenes played out across the galaxy, wherever humans could be found. Mining ships abandoned their asteroid claims and turned toward the relay station. Research vessels left their experiments running on automatic and joined the growing stream of human vessels. Even the fledgling Earth Defense Fleet, with its handful of warships that were considered laughable by galactic standards, received orders to move out. Within 2 hours of the broadcast, over 200 human ships were converging on Relay Station Omega 7. Within 3 hours, that number had grown to 500. The Galactic Concord watched their sensor arrays with growing disbelief as more and more human signatures appeared, pouring through relay points from every corner of explored space. No one had ordered this mass mobilization. No government had issued commands, and yet humans everywhere were moving as one. Aboard the station, Zorath Vel received reports of the approaching human fleet and laughed at the absurdity of it. "What do they think they will accomplish?" he sneered to his advisors. "Their primitive ships are no match for even a single Valith cruiser." But his advisors exchanged worried glances, because this was not about military power, and they were beginning to understand that. The Galactic Concord convened an emergency session to address the crisis, and that was when Dr. Amara Osei arrived. She was humanity's ambassador to the Concord, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. The council chamber fell silent as she walked to the central platform, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Representatives from 100 species watched her, some with curiosity, some with contempt, and some with something that might have been the beginning of respect. I am here to discuss the situation involving the human Marcus Chen, Amara began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber, and to make humanity's position absolutely clear. The Valeth representative, a pompous male named Kethros, stood up to interrupt her. There is nothing to discuss, he declared arrogantly. The human violated our sacred laws and will face the appropriate punishment. Amara turned to look at him with an expression that made several nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. I was not finished speaking, she said coldly, and something in her tone made Kethros sit back down. She turned back to address the full council. Marcus Chen gave food to a starving child, and for that, your sacred laws demand his death. Her voice grew harder with each word. We have heard the arguments about cultural respect and non-interference, and we understand that the Concord was built on those principles. She paused, letting the tension build in the chamber. But humanity was also built on principles. One of those principles is that you do not let children die when you have the power to save them. The chamber erupted in murmurs, but Amara kept speaking over the noise. As we speak, over 1,000 human vessels are approaching Relay Station Omega-7, and more are joining them every minute. She gestured toward the large display screen that showed the sensor data, now crowded with human ship signatures. You may take Marcus Chen if you wish, but understand this clearly. Every human vessel will follow him wherever he goes. Her voice rose, filling the chamber with the weight of her words. Every human worker will leave their post. Every contract will be considered void. Every trade route will close. The murmurs had stopped now, replaced by shocked silence. We will pull ourselves from your stars entirely before we let you execute a man for feeding a hungry child. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every representative she could. And we will never ever return. The Valeth representative jumped to his feet again, his face twisted with outrage. You cannot threaten the Concord, he shouted. You are nothing but primitives who barely learned to fly between stars. Amara smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. You are absolutely right. We are new here. We are weak by your standards, and our technology is primitive compared to yours. She turned to face him directly. But you see, that is exactly why you should take us seriously, because we know what we are risking. Her voice dropped lower, but somehow it seemed even more powerful. We know that we cannot win a military conflict against the Valeth hegemony. We know that leaving the Concord might doom humanity to isolation and poverty. She spread her hands in a gesture of absolute certainty, and we are willing to accept all of that rather than abandon one man who did nothing except show compassion to a suffering child. The chamber was completely silent now. Ask yourselves what kind of species would make that choice, Amara continued. Ask yourselves what we might do if we ever become strong. She let that sink in for a moment. And then, ask yourselves if you really want to make an enemy of a species that values its principles more than its survival. She stepped back from the central platform, her message delivered. Humanity awaits your decision, but we will not wait long, and we will not negotiate. Outside the station, more human ships continued to arrive, their running lights like stars gathering for a constellation that had never existed before. Cargo haulers flew beside research vessels. Mining ships formed up next to the tiny warships of the defense fleet. They came from everywhere, from colony worlds and asteroid bases and orbital stations, from every place where humans had made their home among the stars. None of them knew what would happen next. None of them knew if they were flying towards salvation or destruction. But they knew that one of their own needed them, and that was enough. Marcus Chen sat in his cell, unaware of the storm that was gathering on his behalf. He did not know that his species was rising up for him, that strangers who had never met him were risking everything because of what he had done. But soon he would understand something that the galaxy was only beginning to learn. Humans do not abandon their own, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter what. High Prefect Zoroth Vel stood on the bridge of his warship, watching the human vessels gather around the relay station like insects swarming around a light. He felt nothing but contempt for these primitive creatures who dared to challenge the might of the Valith hegemony. "They are bluffing," he announced to his officers with absolute confidence. "They will back down when they realize we are not afraid of their pathetic fleet." He ordered a broadcast sent across all frequencies, a message of defiance that would crush any remaining hope the humans might have. "I am High Prefect Zoroth Vel, and I speak for the Valith hegemony." His voice boomed through the communication network, reaching every ship and station in the sector. "The human Marcus Chen has committed an unforgivable crime against our sacred laws, and he will be executed. This is not open to debate." He smiled cruelly as he continued. "If humanity wishes to remove itself from the Galactic Concord, we welcome their departure. The galaxy will be better without their presence." He cut the transmission with a satisfied gesture, certain that his show of strength would end this foolish rebellion. But he was wrong, terribly wrong, because something was happening that he had not expected. The first surprise came from the Mordeth Collective, an ancient species that had remained silent for nearly 300 years. They were among the oldest races in the galaxy, and their opinion carried weight that even the Valith could not ignore. Their message was simple, just 7 words that changed everything. "We stand with the humans on this matter." Zoroth Vel stared at the communication screen in disbelief as more messages began pouring in. The Solani Federation, a peaceful species that avoided all conflict, announced that their fleet would join the human vessels. The Kreth, a warrior race that had openly mocked humanity since their arrival in the galactic community, sent a direct message to Marcus Chen. "You showed courage that we had forgotten existed. Our blades are yours to command." One by one, species that had watched the Kethsera system for generations began to find their voices. The Telrath, the Orvani, the crystalline minds of Sector 9, all of them broadcast messages of support for the human cause. They had all seen the suffering of the Kethsera. They had all whispered their discomfort in private, but none of them had ever spoken out. Until one human had simply refused to look away. Zoroth Vel felt cold fear creeping into his heart for the first time as he watched the coalition growing against him. But the greatest blow was yet to come, and it would strike from within his own people. A single Valith ship broke away from the hegemony formation and broadcast a signal requesting permission to speak before the gathered fleet. Zoroth Vel recognized the vessel immediately, and his blood ran cold. It belonged to his own sister, a woman named Vela Vel, and she had always disagreed with his views on the Kethsera. "I must be heard," Vela announced, her voice steady, despite the danger she was putting herself in. "I have information that the galaxy deserves to know." The human ambassador, Dr. Amara Osei, immediately granted her permission to speak. Vela appeared on screens across the sector, a Valith female with kind eyes and a determined expression. "I am going to tell you the truth about the Kethsera caste," she began, "a truth that has been hidden from most of our own people." Zoroth Vel screamed at his communications officer to jam her signal, but it was too late. "We are taught that the Kethsera tradition is ancient, that it goes back to the founding of our civilization, but this is a lie." Vela held up a datapad containing documents that she had spent years gathering. The Kethsera system was invented only 300 years ago by a group of corrupt politicians who wanted to eliminate their enemies. She let that sink in before continuing. They created a religious justification for something that was nothing more than political murder, and they taught our children to accept it as sacred truth. Across the Valith hegemony, billions of people watched in shock as their beliefs crumbled. The Kethsera are not spiritually unclean. They are the descendants of people who dared to oppose tyranny. Vela's voice shook with emotion as she spoke. We have let innocent children die for 3 centuries because we were too afraid to question what we were told. She looked directly into the camera, tears streaming down her face. But one human, one person from a species we called primitive and beneath us, saw a starving child and did what none of us were brave enough to do. She lowered her head in shame. He fed her. He showed her kindness. And we want to kill him for it? Her head came back up, and her eyes were blazing now. I say no more. This ends today. The Kethsera system is a crime against our own people, and it must be abolished. The broadcast ended, and for a moment the entire sector seemed to hold its breath. Then the Velith communication channels exploded with activity. Citizens on a dozen worlds were demanding answers, demanding to know if what Vela had said was true. Military officers who had served the hegemony for decades began questioning their orders. Even aboard Zorath Vel's own warship, crew members were looking at their High Prefect with new and hostile eyes. Zorath Vel felt his power slipping away like sand through his fingers. This changes nothing, he shouted desperately. The humans still violated our laws. He must still be punished. But no one was listening to him anymore. The Velith people had been given something they had never had before, the truth, and they were not going to let it go. In his holding cell, Marcus finally learned what was happening outside. A guard, a young Velith female, approached the transparent wall and bowed her head in a gesture of respect. The human should know, she said softly, that everything is changing because of what he did. She told him about the human fleet, about the other species joining them, about Vela Vel and the truth she had revealed. Marcus listened in stunned silence, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had expected to die, had accepted it as the price for doing the right thing. But instead, his simple act of kindness had sparked something that was spreading across the entire galaxy. What about the girl? Marcus asked urgently. What about the child I fed? Is she safe? Answering. She is still in custody, but the execution order has been suspended. Nothing can happen to her while this situation is unresolved. Marcus closed his eyes and felt relief wash over him, like a warm wave. She was still alive. There was still hope, and as long as there was hope, he would keep fighting. He did not know it yet, but the galaxy was about to change in ways that no one had ever imagined. And it had all started with one man, one child, and one simple act of compassion that refused to stay silent. The collapse of the Velith hegemony's authority happened faster than anyone had predicted. Within hours of Vela Vel's broadcast, protests erupted across every major world under Velith control. Citizens who had lived their entire lives accepting the Kethsera system as sacred truth now marched through the streets demanding justice. They carried images of the little lavender-skinned girl who had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with their society. They chanted the name of Marcus Chen, the human who had shown them that kindness was stronger than tradition. High Prefect Zorath Vel tried to restore order, but his own military refused to obey him. Officers who had once followed his commands without question now looked at him with disgust. You knew, one captain accused him publicly, you knew that the Kethsera laws were invented, that they were nothing but a tool for the powerful to destroy their enemies. Defense, no words that could explain away centuries of manufactured cruelty. He was arrested by his own guards and taken away in chains while crowds cheered. The Velith Council, desperate to save what remained of their government, announced sweeping changes. The Kethsera caste system was officially abolished, and every living Kethsera was granted full citizenship immediately. Billions of people who had been treated as less than nothing suddenly had rights, had names, had futures. It was the largest liberation in galactic history, and it had all begun with one human and one ration bar. The Galactic Concord convened an emergency session to address what had happened. Dr. Amara Osei stood before the council once again, but this time the atmosphere was very different. Representatives who had dismissed humanity as primitive and irrelevant now looked at her with something approaching awe. On behalf of the Galactic Concord, the council speaker announced, "All charges against the human Marcus Chen are formally withdrawn." Applause erupted from dozens of species, something that had never happened before in the history of the council. But the speaker was not finished. Furthermore, the council extends a formal apology to Marcus Chen and to all of humanity. The chamber fell silent, everyone understanding the significance of what was being said. We should have acted long ago. We should have spoken against the Ketsera system instead of hiding behind principles of non-interference. The speaker bowed his head in a gesture of genuine shame. It took a species we considered beneath us to remind us what courage and compassion actually mean. Then came the announcement that shocked everyone. The Galactic Concord hereby offers Earth a permanent seat on the High Council, with full voting rights and privileges. Gasps echoed through the chamber as the implications sank in. Humanity was being elevated from a minor species to a galactic power, not through military conquest or economic might, but through the actions of one ordinary man. Dr. Amara Osei accepted the honor graciously, but her eyes were already searching for the exit. There was somewhere she needed to be. On Relay Station Omega 7, the holding cell door slid open, and Marcus Chen walked out into freedom. He blinked in the bright lights of the corridor, still unable to fully believe that this was real. Human officers surrounded him, shaking his hand and slapping his back, and telling him how proud they were. But Marcus barely heard them, his eyes scanning the crowd for someone else. Then he saw her. The little Valith girl stood at the end of the corridor, wearing clean clothes and looking healthier than she had in the maintenance tunnels. A medical team had been caring for her, giving her food and treatment, and something she had never experienced before: genuine kindness. When she saw Marcus, her 4 eyes went wide with recognition. She had learned his name, had heard the stories about what he had done for her and for all the Ketsera. But she did not fully understand the politics or the history or the galactic significance of what had happened. All she knew was that this human had seen her when no one else would, had fed her when she was starving, had treated her like she mattered. She ran down the corridor as fast as her small legs could carry her. Marcus dropped to his knees just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. She was crying, sobbing against his shoulder, and he held her tight while his own tears fell. "It is okay," he whispered, the same words he had spoken in that dark maintenance tunnel. "You are safe now, I promise." She looked up at him with those 4 beautiful eyes and said something in her own language. Not understand the words, but a nearby Valith translated them for him. She said, "Thank you." She said, "You are her family now." Marcus laughed and cried at the same time, hugging the little girl who had changed everything. He had not set out to start a revolution, or liberate billions of people, or earn humanity a seat on the Galactic Council. He had just seen a hungry child, and done the only thing his heart would let him do. Later, when the celebrations had died down and the news drones had finally stopped following him everywhere, a reporter asked Marcus the question that everyone wanted answered. "Why did you do it? Why did you risk everything for one child you did not even know?" Marcus looked at the reporter, then looked at the little girl who sat beside him, her small hand holding his. He thought about all the speeches he could make, all the grand statements about justice and compassion and the nature of humanity. And the truth was much simpler than any of that. "She was hungry," Marcus said with a shrug. "What else was I supposed to do?" The reporter stared at him, waiting for more, but there was nothing more to say. For Marcus Chen, that simple statement contained everything that mattered. The galaxy watched his answer spread across every network and every world. And slowly, species that had existed for thousands of years began to understand something that changed how they saw the universe. Humans were not dangerous because of their technology, or their weapons, or their numbers. They were dangerous because they cared, fiercely and irrationally and beautifully. They would sacrifice everything for a stranger, would burn their own futures to protect someone they had never met. They would stand against empires for a single child, and they would never, ever back down. That kind of compassion could not be fought with warships or politics, or ancient traditions. It could only be answered with compassion in return. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that historians would struggle to describe. The Kethsera, now free, became some of humanity's closest allies, never forgetting who had first seen them as people. Marcus Chen became a legend, though he always insisted he was just a cargo hauler who did the right thing. And the little girl he saved, who eventually took the name Vela in honor of the woman who had revealed the truth, grew up to become one of the greatest diplomats the galaxy had ever known. But she never forgot the man who had knelt beside her in the dark and offered her food when no one else would. She never forgot what it felt like to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. And whenever anyone asked her what made humans special, she would smile and give the same answer. They care, she would say simply, and they will never stop caring, no matter what. That was humanity's gift to the stars, and the stars would never be the same.